My name is Bert, and this is the Still Life Podcast. Welcome back, and thanks for joining me on episode 10 of the Still Life Podcast. Today we start part 3 of Memories from My Deployment. So, diving right on in, I'll tell you one of the most humbling experiences that I had on the deployment. And that was the day that I got to go into Iraq and actually do a POW camp evaluation. So we got a pretty early jump on the day. We loaded up a bunch of cases of MREs and water into our van and loaded up on dollar bills, and then we headed north towards the Kuwait-Iraq border. So we had a fairly decent road trip. It was about 2.5-3 hours across the Iraqi border to the port at Qasr. Now, when we got to the Kuwait-Iraq border, it was really just kind of odd. It was kind of middle of nowhere, desolate desert area, and there was this big fence and then these big pits on either side. And they were guarded, but I wouldn't say they were by any means fortified. There were armed guards at the gates in and out of the border, but really that was it. There wasn't really much going on in either direction. It was just this vast desert kind of wasteland place. So we crossed the border into Iraq, and again, not a whole lot going on, just kind of this deserted wasteland, almost like a Mad Max kind of, or Star Wars-esque desert landscape kind of thing going on. But after getting into Iraq a little ways, we started to see kind of like actual, like dirt roads really, and we started to see these little mud huts. Now, when we saw the mud huts, of course, we started seeing people, Iraqi people that were living in these mud huts, families of, 4, 6, 8 people in these mud huts. And we were able to interact a little bit with those folks. And that's where the water, the MREs, and the dollar bills came into play. We were exchanging water, food, and American dollars for Iraqi dinar, which, those were collectible to us because they all had Saddam's face on them. So, we were trading good money for basically worthless paper, and then, in turn, they were able to take that money and buy rice to feed their family, because the exchange rate at that time was somewhere around 2,000 to 3,000 Iraqi dinar to $1 American dollar. So, giving these families, $1, $5, $10 American would feed their family for a month or more at a time. And the other thing that really kind of struck a chord with me was the fact that, anytime I saw Iraq on TV, they always showed Baghdad, which is a very populated area, and it's very established and fairly modern. And it was quite the shock when we were going through these villages of mud huts and how desolate it was, and there were people surviving, and trying to carve out a living and a survival in the desert. And so just to actually see that firsthand was incredibly humbling, and it made me very grateful for all of the things that I have, and being able to go back to my tent at Camp Arifjan at the end of the day, I was so grateful for an air-conditioned tent, because they didn't even have air conditioning. They lived in whatever the weather was. If it was warm, they were warm. If it was cold, they were cold, and that really was it. So all in all, I think we probably spent between about 45 minutes and an hour kind of distributing food and water and money to these people before we had to move on, make our way up to and through Qasr and then to the POW camp. So if you recall, almost 20 years ago, one of the first major battles in Iraq took place at the port at Qasr. So we were, a few weeks post-battle, and it was just deserted. We made it to the port, and there was nothing there, nobody. And I mean, you could tell there had been fighting. There were, bullet holes and chunks taken out of the concrete, on the sides of buildings, and windows broken out of buildings. And it looked like it had been a war zone, because in fact it was. And again, it was kind of a reality check that, we are in a combat zone and we are not safe. So it was, again, one of those kind of like, yeah, we're going back to Kuwait at the end of the day and going to our tent, but we are very much not in a safe environment. So we kind of walked around the port for a few and just kind of observed, the damage from the conflict there. And then we hopped back in the van and made our way to the POW camp. So as we approach the POW camp, again, this was a kind of a gut check, reality check, very humbling moment. Again, you see things on TV, you see stuff on the news, you see pictures of things, and you're like, oh man, that looks terrible, it's awful. All these Iraqis were treated so poorly and terribly, and then you see it. You see the line of Iraqis waiting to get into the POW camp, where they would get a fresh set of clothes and a hot meal, and they would get assigned to a tent. And it really, I don't know what I was expecting, but it was far beyond anything I had imagined or expected in my head. Just to see that they were so willing to, lay down their arms and give up and surrender, because we were treating them better as POWs than their own country was treating them as a part of the military or the militias. And so it was just incredibly humbling to see, essentially how little it took to give them something better than they were receiving in their own country. And again, that just really, hit home with me. And, at the end of the day, when we returned back to camp, I remember going to my tent and just crying, because my heart hurt for these people. At one point in time, they were our enemies and they were trying to kill us. And all we offered them really was a tent, some fresh clothes, and food. And they were willing to surrender for that little. And it made me hurt just on a human level. And so incredibly humbling experience. I'm sure if I continue to talk, I'll remember more and more details, but really, it was something that will stick with me for the rest of my life, and something I do have to remind myself of is, that we have so very much, even when we have very little, we have so much more than so many other people. And on the human level, it's pretty humbling to say that even at our lowest, we are very well blessed to be where we are at. So, just be thankful that we are where we are and we have what we have, because it could be night and day difference, and it could be absolutely so much worse. So, I encourage you to remember that, as we complain about the little things in life, that at least we have those things to complain about. So that concludes part 3 of Memories from My Deployment. I want to thank you again for joining me today on the Still Life podcast. And as always, for questions, comments, topic ideas, or suggestions, or if you'd like to become a sponsor of the Still Life podcast, you can email us, thestilllifepodcast@gmail.com. That's the stilllifepodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again for joining me today on the Still Life podcast, and we'll talk again soon.